The history of Mabry-Hazen House goes back to 1858, but the family history goes back further than that. Joseph Alexander Mabry, the original builder and owner of the home, was born in East Tennessee in 1826. His father, the eponymous Joseph Alexander Mabry, owned about 2,000 acres and about 30 slaves in the vicinity of Concord, just in what is now West Knoxville. But when Joseph was a young boy, he lost his father, not of natural causes, rather of a gunfight in Tuscaloosa, Alabama. But when Joseph came of age, he received a significant inheritance from his father. He was given about a 50 overall estate, as well as $2,500 to make his start. And if you transpose that to 2017 currency, that's about $80,000 today, so a lot of money. But Joseph would make a number of investments, and we'd probably call him a venture capitalist, but he speculated in real estate, invested in the railroad, and participated in the slave trade here in East Tennessee. He was one of the original developers of Knoxville's iconic Market Square, purchasing the land and then donating it to the city in 1853. He invested heavily in the Knoxville and Kentucky Railroad until he became the president of it in 1855. He bred racing horses and gambled on them all throughout the South, and he was one of Knoxville's largest slave owners by the end of the 1850s, owning about 17 individuals. He also made an advantageous marriage. He married Laura Churchwell in 1852. He and Laura had 14 children together. Sadly, 6 would die before the age of 5 of varying childhood illnesses, but they saw 8 of their children advance into adulthood. Joseph and Laura began construction on what they called Pine Hill Cottage in 1857, but we now know as Mabry-Hazen House. The home is an Italianate-style home, which was popular all throughout the United States in the mid-19th century for a couple of reasons. It helped convey a sense of taste and culture because of its popularity and its sense of fashion. But it also was practical in nature. The architectural designs within the home helped to temper the hot southern summers by kind of integrating designs that naturally ventilated and circulated air within the home. But this house was built in a kind of a wild time in U.S. history, the impending crisis of secession in 1861 and then the looming threat of the Civil War will quickly erupt here in East Tennessee. Mabry was a staunch Confederate. He pledged $100,000 to the Confederate cause in 1861. However, it's kind of difficult when your total worth is $91,000. But he did contribute materially and morally to the Confederate cause in the early years of the war. But in 1863, after 2 years of Confederate control, the city was occupied by Union forces. And Mabry seized upon a kind of a pragmatic opportunity. 2 days after the arrival of federal troops, Joseph Mabry approached a Union officer and stated, "I am a notorious rebel, and these people will tell you so. However, whatever I have that will be of use to your army, I will happily give." It seems his business interest outweighed his personal loyalties. But here on Mabry's Hill, where the house is located, this would actually become a major defensive point in the defenses of Knoxville, and Union troops would heavily fortify this position with earthen trenches and 2 batteries of artillery. In November of 1863, when James Longstreet, one of the famous Confederate generals, was reconnoitering lines to see if he could find a possible exploitation point, actually looked at the lines upon Mabry's Hill and was utterly disappointed by what he found there, and ended up, because of that, assaulting the western lines near Fort Sanders. After the Civil War, the Mabrys unfortunately saw an economic downturn while the rest of the city saw an economic boom. Mabry's railroad, the Knoxville and Kentucky, was supposed to go from Knoxville to Kentucky. But by 1869, he'd actually only gotten about 30 miles outside the city, so just outside Clinton. And he'd subsidized most of the construction through state loan. And in 1869, the state legislature called in Mabry's debt. He was unable to pay out this $2 million debt, and ended up having to sell off large acreages of his property. And these land liquidations ultimately led to his death. In 1881, he sold a piece of property to Thomas O'Connor. O'Connor and Mabry were former business associates, but O'Connor had risen to a point of economic prominence and earned the position of bank president in downtown Knoxville. Joseph Mabry, though, contended that there was a promise made to him within this agreement. Mabry said O'Connor promised to give back a small section of that transaction called the Cold Springs Farm to Willie Mabry. On Christmas Eve of 1881, only a few months after the deal, Willie Mabry was shot in a bar brawl on Christmas Eve. And the death struck Joseph Mabry particularly hard, compounded with the financial losses he had taken to the Baltimore. His legendary temper became shorter, but the most pernicious consequence was he became paranoid. He believed a murder plot had been hatched by Thomas O'Connor to kill Willie Mabry and prevent the return of his Cold Springs farm. And Mabry brooded over this for about a year until in October of 1882, Joseph Mabry confronted O'Connor at the racetracks south of the Tennessee River. Armed and ready to duel, he threw down the gauntlet right then and there, but O'Connor declared this was neither the time nor the place, and the argument was broken up for the afternoon. Throughout the night, though, the two men actually continued to exchange notes, with the last note from Joseph Mabry reading, "The next time I see you, I will shoot you on sight." The following day, October 19th, 1882, was a rainy day in Knoxville. Still, Joseph Mabry and a companion took a stroll down Gay Street, and as they approached Church Street, they neared the Mechanics Bank, where the bank president, Thomas O'Connor, stood outside the bank doors. Armed and with a shotgun, as Mabry crossed opposite the street, Thomas O'Connor retrieved a shotgun from inside the bank doors and took aim at Joseph Mabry and fired. And Mabry slumped over dead. I suppose to make sure the deed was done, O'Connor discharged a second barrel into Mabry and proceeded to begin walking back towards his bank. Only a block away, a young lawyer named Joseph Alexander Mabry III was meeting with a local justice and heard the gunshots. He stepped onto Gay Street and saw O'Connor walking back towards the bank doors with a shotgun in hand, and saw his father's corpse in the middle of the street. Young Joe Mabry was well aware of the family feud and was armed, and he proceeded to close the gap to seek vengeance on his father's murderer right there. O'Connor, though, had not gone back to the bank doors. Rather, he'd gone back and he'd retrieved a second shotgun unknown to Mabry. As young Joe Mabry closed the gap and pulled his revolver to fire, O'Connor turned to his right, seeing Mabry. They took aim, they pulled the trigger, and they both fell dead within a second of each other. And within about 2 minutes, 3 prominent Knoxvillians lay dead on Gay Street. And the story hit the telegraph wires almost instantaneously, and was transferred to New York City, where it was published in the New York Times, and then it made its way out west, where Mark Twain picked up on it. And in his memoirs, Life on a Mississippi, Twain actually recounted the tale of the gunfight on Gay Street, using it as a wry example of Southern chivalry, and just with a hint of sarcasm, saying this was how Southern gentlemen took care of their business disputes. The deaths of Joseph Mabry Jr. and Willie Mabry left Laura Mabry and the remaining children in a great deal of financial insecurity, though. Victorian womanhood really prescribed women maintain the home, the children, and the servants, and often they did not have a strong outside income source. But fortunately for Laura and the children, her eldest daughter, Alice Mabry, was engaged to Rush Strong Hazen, and 3 months after the gunfight on Gay Street, Rush and Alice were wed. Rush Hazen was actually a very successful wholesale grocer in Knoxville, and he helped stabilize the family finances. Unlike his father-in-law, Hazen was a much more tempered man, and despite his success, was well known for his philanthropy. He donated large sums of money to the First Presbyterian Church, where he was an elder. He served on the city council in the 1920s. During that time, he also organized a committee that raised over $65,000 to purchase the Palace Hotel on Clinch Avenue. Once the building was purchased, Hazen and his committee donated the building to the YMCA, and they continue to use that facility to the present. He was a major committee member in bringing the National Expositions to Knoxville in 1910 and 1911. He was a major donor to Lenora Wood, an educator and reformer who went out into the rural districts of Appalachia and established schools. And there are numerous infrastructure projects that bear his name from his contributions to their construction. His wife, Alice Hazen, was very much like her mother, though, a strong Victorian woman and really exuding female dignity and rectitude. She had long hemlines and high collars, and always carried herself with that corseted straight back, and her physical appearance actually really matched her etiquette and her manners as well. She really tried to teach her children proper Victorian mores and behaviors, but as you'll see, she got caught up against the tides of the 20th century and changing attitudes of womanhood and proper decorum. Alice and Rush would actually live outside the Mabry-Hazen house for several years before they moved in about 1890, and they made several significant additions to the home as well. In the 1880s to about 1890, they added 2 side porches to the house, as well as a back one-story addition that added a new bedroom, a modern kitchen, and indoor plumbing to the house. Rush and Alice had 3 daughters, though. They'd have Lillian was born in 1884, Maria was born in 1886, and finally Evelyn was born in 1899. And Evelyn Hazen is the main protagonist of our next story. Evelyn grew up largely an only child because of the disparity in age between her and her sisters, and her father doted upon her like it. This favoritism actually engendered a little bit of jealousy between her sisters and occasionally even her mother. But Evelyn was precocious, well-spoken, a dedicated student, beautiful, but she did have her grandfather's fiery temper. Actually, a teacher once remarked, if Evelyn had been born a boy, she would have been governor of Tennessee. But Evelyn attended UT, the University of Tennessee, at age 15, earned her degree in English. Upon graduation, she actually spent a summer in New York City and worked as a correspondent for the New York Times. After her assignment there, she moved back to Knoxville and began a career as an English teacher at Knoxville High School on Central Avenue. But sadly, her life is, despite these early successes of her career, her life is marred by tragedy as well, but not of gunfights and black powder, rather of the heart. In 1917, Evelyn began an ill-fated love affair with a man named Ralph Sheringhouse. Ralph's family was a wealthy business family that owned several department stores in downtown Knoxville. And Evelyn was, a young socialite from an established elite Southern family. And so it seemed a good match. And at the time, it was common practice for kind of the nouveau riche to marry into these old families. And the relationship started off well between Ralph and Evelyn. There was an interruption, though, when the U.S. entered into World War I. Ralph joined the Army and was commissioned an officer, but was never assigned overseas. Rather, he was put at a training camp outside Charleston. During his assignment there, he and Evelyn actually exchanged love letters frequently. And upon one of his furloughs, he returned to Knoxville. And he proposed marriage to Evelyn. They went to the courthouse that afternoon to get their marriage certificate, but they had missed a deadline that day. And the following day was Sunday, and the day after that, Ralph returned to duty. But Mr. Sheringhouse had a bit of a silver tongue and convinced Evelyn that they were married in the eyes of God and 100 times over, and so they consummated the relationship. a major social taboo for a woman of Evelyn's social standing, as reputation was an integral aspect of femininity at that time, especially amongst the elite and upper classes. And the knowledge she had engaged in sex before marriage would have tarnished her reputation. But she fully expected upon Ralph's return to have her wedding date and have this stain upon her kind of removed. When the war ended, Ralph came home and began work at his parents' department store, but instead of offering a wedding date, he offered an excuse. He stated he needed to establish himself independently of his family's wealth and build his own business from the ground up. And these seemed like a legitimate need to wait for Evelyn, and so she abstained. By 1920, she's still waiting on her wedding date, though. But Ralph did buy her an engagement ring in that year, which is the material symbol of his promise. But Evelyn waited until 1925 to even have a wedding date. It's in March of that year. But a poor outing between Evelyn and Ralph's parents resulted in its postponement. Evelyn desired to have their blessing and be in their good graces, and she felt with one date set, it wouldn't be difficult to schedule another. But she couldn't have been more wrong, because by 1930, she is still waiting on a wedding date. She went to her father even for help. She became so desperate and asked him to go talk to Ralph and see if he really is dedicated to following through on this promise, this engagement. Mabry-Hazen met with Ralph and pressured him to follow through on his promise to marry Evelyn. Ralph again was able to convince Rush of his good intentions, and Mabry-Hazen returned this message to his daughter, and she acquiesced half-heartedly. At this point, merely wanting the wedding to be able just to justify her behavior, I doubt she even loved Ralph in the same way she initially did. You can see the pressures of womanhood really kind of constricting her and what she can do, because by 1932 she's even still waiting on the wedding. And at this point, the relationship deteriorated. Ralph and Evelyn rarely go out socially any longer. More damaging were the rumors now circulating all throughout Knoxville in 1932. Their romps between the sheets had finally kind of slipped past the bedroom into the rumor mill. And they gained enough notoriety, Evelyn was fired from her teaching position at Knoxville High School. The superintendent terminating her for failing to provide a proper moral character despite her renown as an excellent teacher. The superintendent even commented on this in his letter. In June of 1932, Ralph Sheringhouse broke up with Evelyn Hazen after 15 years of engagement. Through a letter, no less. 7 days after the breakup, though, Evelyn experienced another tragedy. Her father died. And taken together, the grief and heartache broke Evelyn down, and her temper gained the better of her. She made public exclamations of her intention to kill Ralph. She began conspiring in letters to kill her former fiancé, even going as far to purchase a weapon. The fellow conspirator, her friend though, advised her against such brass action and advised her to go to her mother, and Evelyn Hazen did. But remember, Alice Hazen was a Victorian woman, and their values emphasized impulse control, and they had a rigid sense of personal accountability. The revelations her daughter had engaged in sex before marriage and then plotted murder must have galled and appalled Alice Hazen. Uncertain how to deal with these revelations, Alice went to her brothers, Evelyn's uncles, and the three of them decided to commit Evelyn to an asylum. But within a month, Evelyn was released, with the superintendent stating she was never insane. You know, if we're being honest, it was probably just a really toxic mixture of heartache and grief. But Evelyn was not willing to let a dead dog lay and wanted vengeance. In late 1932, she revealed to Ralph her intention to sue him for breach of promise to marry and seduction, which seems antiquated to modern listeners because At least within the courtrooms, we've seen a greater equality emerge amongst the sexes. But at the time, marriage was partly seen as a financial transaction. By remaining with Ralph for 15 years, Evelyn lost out on a great deal of money, and she wanted reparations, especially considering she lost her job. Ralph ran off to avoid the scandal, though, and for nearly a year, Evelyn searched for his locale. Finally, in late 1933, Evelyn discovered it outside of Covington, Kentucky. She sped up there and served him papers. In February of 1934, Ralph v. Sheringhouse commenced. And by the end of the month, Evelyn was vindicated. She won the trial and was awarded $80,000 in the middle of the Great Depression. Not only that, she was awarded the money by a jury of her peers, all of them men. But it's unlikely Evelyn saw a dime of the award. Throughout the trial, Ralph had claimed poverty and bankruptcy, but it's more likely he probably had just transferred his assets over to his father for safekeeping and hiding. Despite this victory, when Evelyn returned home to Knoxville, she found herself chastised and outcasted by Knoxville society. The trial was open to the public, and Knoxville newspapers scenting a juicy story about two socialites, now former lovers, openly revealing all the salacious details of their relationship was too good to pass up. And nearly every day, the Knoxville newspapers printed tabloid-esque stories of the trial for prying eyes to read upon. Evelyn, because of this, was removed from the social register of Knoxville, kicked out of social clubs. Several family members shunned her for years because she had aired dirty laundry. She estranged many friends as well because they had been forced to pick sides. And Evelyn then retreated here into the Mabry-Hazen house and would spend the next 50 years of her life within this home. She never married and she never had children. In the 1940s, she did earn a position at the University of Tennessee's English department. In the 1950s and 60s and 70s, Evelyn became a staunch opponent to urban renewal projects in East Knoxville neighborhoods where she owned several rental properties. In the 1960s, she unwittingly actually became an early historic preservationist here in the city. When Joseph Mabry donated the land to Knoxville in 1853, he had a couple clauses that helped protect the property in the long term. The final clause came back to bite the city in the 1960s, almost 100 years later. It stated that if the property was ever used for anything other than a public market, the property reverted back to the ownership of the Mabry and their heirs. And in the 1960s, the city of Knoxville had plans to redevelop the area into possibly an interior mall or a parking garage, and Evelyn and her uncle Churchwell sued the city of Knoxville and won the trial. And rather than pay out the settlement, the city continued to keep the property as a public market. But sadly, Evelyn's successes were kind of she always had the trial and its consequences hanging over her. And in the last decade of her life, Evelyn became an eccentric recluse. She really kind of imprisoned herself in this house. She let the exterior run down. Most of the interior rooms would have been just stacked high with yellowing newspapers. There were dogs all across the front porch and about 15, 20 cats in the house. The consequences of emotional trauma, of the lack of family around her, because neither of her sisters had children and they had both died in 1937. She saw tremendous changes in the built environment around her, and also those are just major ways that you connect with a space and help keep your memory together. But when she died in 1987, Evelyn wanted a legacy for her family and for herself. And she said there were two possible outcomes for the home and this property upon her death. In her will, she dictated that the home All the possessions within the home were to be sold, and then the land auctioned off, and those proceeds donated to the Humane Society, and the house razed to the ground. The other option was to convert the home into a museum, and you can see which choice was taken. After 5 years of rehabilitation and restoration, the home opened as a public museum in 1992, and we've been operating as one of the historic homes of Knoxville for the past 25 years. The Mabry family and Hazen family has a rich but colorful history, and they made significant contributions to the early developments of Knoxville. And the Mabry-Hazen house continues to tell their stories, but also it is able to expand out and teach us about life here in Knoxville, in the United States, and in the world during, from 1858 all the way until 1988. And because of the continuity of the family history or the family possession of the house, because of the continuity of the family within the home, Mabry-Hazen House preserves one of the largest original family collections in the United States. When you step into the home, you see the furnishings, decor, and possessions of the family, and it's neat. It's a time capsule, and you're transported back into the life of this elite family, and it's got some exceptional stories to tell.